August 4th, 1945, a burning hot afternoon outside a German POW camp in the Arizona desert. American soldiers walk up to a German mother and her 3 little children, not to arrest them, but to take the children away in a military truck. The air smells of dust and diesel, the metal tailgate slams shut, and 3 enemy children vanish into the heat while their mother is ordered to stand still and say nothing. She has been told all her life that Americans would be cruel, that they would tear families apart, and now she watches them do exactly that, to save her children's lives. 2 days later, the same army that took her children will bring her to a place she never expected, and what happens in one small hospital room will change all of their ideas about the enemy. Stay with me to the end to see how a nurse, a doctor, and one broken rule turned wartime hatred into a lifelong bond. And if you want more true World War II stories told like this, please subscribe, like the video, and support the channel so we can keep bringing these hidden histories to light. This is not propaganda or legend. It really happened, and it may change the way you think about war, mercy, and who your enemies are. February 1945. Munich was a broken city. Whole streets were nothing but bricks and smoke-stained walls. In a small room near the railway yards lived a 32-year-old widow named Katharina Föber and her 3 children, 7-year-old Hans, 5-year-old Greta, and little Emil, only 3. Her husband had died in North Africa in 1942. Now she worked as a clerk in a supply office, copying numbers while bombs shook the windows, trying to feed 3 young mouths in a country that was falling apart. For years, the radio and posters had told her what would happen if the Americans came. They would be cruel, the voices said. They would tear families apart. They would treat Germans like animals. Katharina believed it enough to whisper warnings to her children at night. Be quiet, be obedient, be invisible. When word came that she and other civilians linked to the German army would be shipped to America as prisoners, her first thought was simple and cold. They will hurt my children. The journey began with a train ride north to a crowded port. The station smelled of coal smoke and bodies that had not been washed in days. Soldiers shouted names. Children cried. Hans gripped his mother's hand so hard it hurt. Later, he would remember the sound of boots on the platform and the way the winter air cut through his thin coat more clearly than anything else. The ship that waited in the harbour was grey and huge. Hundreds of German prisoners were herded up the gangway, Katharina and the other women and children last. Somewhere on that ocean, part of a much larger system, over 370,000 German POWs were already held in camps across the United States. The Atlantic crossing took nearly 2 weeks. The holds smelled of metal, sweat, and boiled cabbage. At night, waves thudded against the hull like distant bombs. On deck, when they were allowed up, the wind tasted of salt instead of dust and ash. Katharina had expected shouting guards and blows. Instead, the American sailors were brisk and distant. They counted the prisoners twice a day. They checked lists. They kept everyone in their place, but they did not beat them. I expected blows, not boredom, she would later say. It was not kindness exactly. It was something stranger, a cold, strict fairness that did not match the posters she had seen back home. One grey morning, the New York skyline rose out of the mist. Smokestacks, cranes, tall buildings all in one piece. No bomb craters, no ruins. As the ship slipped into harbour, Hans stared, pressed against the rail. Why didn't anyone bomb this? He asked. Katharina had no answer. The smell of the port, oil, salt, coffee from some warehouse they could not see, was the smell of a world that had not been smashed flat. They were taken to Ellis Island. For Katharina, the name meant nothing, only another unknown place in the enemy's country. Inside, the noise of many languages bounced off high ceilings. The Americans moved them from table to table. Clerks filled out forms in triplicate. Doctors checked eyes, throats, chests. Thermometers clicked. Stethoscopes touched skin. No one shouted, no one struck them. The officials looked tired, not hateful. Katharina, who had braced for torture, found instead endless waiting and paperwork. This wasn't propaganda, she would think in confusion. This was something else. This was normal. It did not feel like mercy, but it also did not feel like the revenge she had been promised. From Ellis Island, they were loaded onto another train, this time heading west into a country almost impossibly wide. Day after day, the landscape changed outside the dirty windows. Cities rolled past with whole streets still standing, glass unbroken, factories roared, miles of farms spread out like green and brown quilts. At night, railroad crossings flashed red in small towns that had never heard an air raid siren. Huns asked questions without stopping. Why are there so many cars? Why are the houses not broken? Where are we going? He pressed his nose to the glass until his breath fogged it. Greta sat close to her mother, twisting her fingers in her dress. Emil slept, woke, and pointed at cows, amazed. Katharina watched it all with a tight feeling in her chest. The enemy country was rich, full, alive. Her own country was caves and cellars and hunger. Americans on the train, soldiers, railway workers, civilians, stared at the group of German women and children. The looks were sharp, with curiosity, not pure hate. Some eyes even held a flicker of pity when they saw Emil coughing or Greta's thin legs. The contrast was sharp. They had been taught that Americans were monsters. Here, in this crowded train car, Americans were just people in clean coats eating sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. After days of travel, the guards finally named their destination, a prisoner of war camp outside a growing city called Phoenix in the state of Arizona. Camp Papago Park spread across roughly 700 acres of desert on the edge of town. To Katharina, the word Arizona meant nothing. To her children, it sounded like another planet. As the train neared the desert, the world outside turned to rust-red dirt and scattered cactus. The sky grew larger, the air drier, the light harsher. Somewhere ahead, beyond barbed wire and watchtowers, they would find out what it meant to live as prisoners under an enemy flag and discover a kind of safety they had never expected to find there. When the train finally stopped, the heat hit them like a wall. The air outside smelled of dust, hot metal, and dry plants. Ahead stood rows of wire fences, wooden towers, and long, low barracks. This was Camp Papago Park, spread over about 700 acres of Arizona desert. Somewhere inside it, more than 3,000 German prisoners were already living under American guard. Katharina and her children were taken to a smaller fenced area off to one side. This was the women's compound, built for a much smaller group, just 47 German women and their children, kept apart from the men. The wire here was lower, the watchtowers a little farther away, but the message was still clear. They were prisoners. An American sergeant read out names. A clerk checked them off on a clipboard. No one smiled. No one raised a hand in anger either. Orders were brief. "Barrack 7, a guard said, pointing with his pencil, not his rifle. The ground was packed dirt, pale and powdery. It crunched under their shoes. Barrack 7 was a rectangle of sun-faded boards with windows that did not quite close. Inside were metal bunk beds, thin mattresses, a narrow stove at one end. The place already held 4 other families. In total, 15 people were sleeping in a space built for 8. Bunks were stacked so close that when someone turned over at night, the bed frames squeaked all down the row. There was almost no privacy. A thin blanket could be hung to make a curtain, but everyone still heard everything. Babies crying, mothers whispering, a child's bad dream. Yet the paradox was sharp. In bombed-out Munich, they had sometimes slept in cellars, not knowing if the next night would come. Here, behind the enemy's wire, the roof did not shake with explosions. We were behind fences, Hans would later say, but we slept without listening for bombs. Daily life took shape quickly. At dawn, a whistle blew. Everyone lined up in the yard for a head count. The sun was already hot, burning the tops of their ears. After roll call came breakfast in the small kitchen hut. American rations arrived in crates marked U.S. Army. Flour, canned meat, dried beans, powdered milk. The German women turned them into simple meals. The food was plain, but it came 3 times a day. It was the first time in months we knew we would eat again tomorrow, one woman later wrote. That calm thought tasted strange after wartime hunger. American white bread, baked from their flour, felt soft and springy in the mouth. To Katharina it seemed almost too smooth, too rich, but it filled her children's stomachs. A spare room at the end of the barracks became a school. Someone had found old textbooks. A former teacher among the prisoners used them to teach reading, sums, and geography. The chalk dust hung in the air. The wooden floor creaked under small feet. Hans sat on a bench with other boys, tracing letters with his finger. When he looked out the window, he could see a guard tower, and, beyond it, the empty desert. Learning under the rifles of the enemy was another strange contrast no poster had prepared him for. In the yard, the children carved out a kind of childhood. There was a small, fenced patch of hard earth where they were allowed to play. The boys kicked a rag ball, argued over rules, and sometimes copied the guards, pretending to march and call commands. Now and then an American soldier leaned on the fence to watch, the sun glinting off his belt buckle. Some of them tossed chewing gum or showed how to throw a baseball, then stepped back quickly as if remembering invisible rules. Greta stayed close to the women at first. In the kitchen, she learned to knead dough, her small hands sinking into the sticky mass. The smell of baking bread filled the hut, thick and warm. American flour, German hands. She picked up a few English words. Bread, sorry, thank you, from labels and from soft-spoken supply sergeants. Emil, still only 3, wandered between bunks and doorways collecting pebbles and watching lizards flash across the floorboards. For him, the barbed wire was just part of the world, like fences back home had been. He knew nothing of front lines or borders. His universe was his mother's lap and the taste of soup in a metal bowl. For Katharina, each small comfort was edged with guilt. She knew that back in Germany, whole cities lay in ruins. In some places, over 80% of buildings were damaged or destroyed. Families lived in cellars and ruins, standing in long lines for thin soup. Here, in the enemy's camp, her children had a bed and regular meals. It felt wrong, she would later admit, to be safer with the Americans than with our own people. The camp had a tiny clinic, just 1 doctor, and 2 medical assistants for the whole prisoner population. Everyone knew supplies went first to soldiers at the front, not to captured enemies. Still, it was some comfort to know a doctor existed behind the wire, even if his shelves were not full. Life in Camp Papago Park settled into a pattern: heat, dust, roll calls, meals, work details, lessons, play. Under the guard towers, German children learned to laugh again. Under the same towers, their mothers tried to rebuild some idea of normal life. It was a fragile piece, built on routines and shared need. But close beds, shared cups, and many small bodies in one hot room are dangerous in another way. One day, a rumour moved down the barracks. A child in Barrack 3 had broken out in a red rash and fever. What began as a quiet worry would soon test the limits of this calm life behind the enemy's wire. The sickness started quietly. In July, the days were even hotter, the air in the barracks thick and still. One afternoon, a boy in Barrack 3 lay on his bunk with bright red spots on his face and a high fever. By evening, 2 more children were ill. Within days, the rumour had a name: measles. In a place where 40 or 50 people might share one long barrack, a disease like that moves fast. Windows were kept open, but the air did not move. Children shared cups, blankets, toys. Soon the camp doctor, an American captain named Richardson, was seeing more and more small patients. By the end of the week, 17 children in the women's compound were sick, and 3 of them were already in serious danger. Richardson's clinic was really just a wooden hut with a few narrow beds and metal cabinets. Supplies were limited: bandages, a few kinds of medicine, some old glass thermometers, a small supply of newer drugs. The US Army had to spread its medical stocks across millions of soldiers, dozens of bases, and hundreds of hospitals. A prisoner of war camp was not at the top of the list. Still, he did what he could. He checked temperatures, listened to lungs, gave fluids where possible. "I was trained for bullet wounds," he later wrote, "not a children's ward made of barbed wire and dust." The smell of antiseptic could not quite cover the sour scent of sweat and fear. Hans was the first of Katharina's children to fall ill. One morning, he woke up quiet, which was already strange. Red spots dotted his neck. His forehead burned under his mother's hand. When she led him to the clinic, the ground seemed to sway under her feet. Hans, usually all quick questions and restless energy, lay limp while Richardson checked his throat and chest. Greta followed 2 days later. Her small body shook with fever, and the rash spread quickly. Emil, still only 3, tried to climb into his mother's lap, but could barely keep his eyes open. Within a week, all 3 children lay in their bunks in Barrack 7, faces flushed, eyes glassy. Katharina moved from bed to bed with a wet cloth, a cup of water, a soft whisper. She did not sleep. The paradox grew sharp. They had escaped the bombs of Germany only to face a tiny enemy they could not see. "We were finally safe from the war," one mother said, "and then the sickness came instead." Outside, the desert shimmered in waves of heat. Inside, small chests rose and fell too fast. Richardson visited often, his boots leaving fine prints in the dust on the barrack floor. Through a camp interpreter, he tried to explain. Measles itself usually passed, but in some cases it attacked the lungs or the brain. Pneumonia, encephalitis. Complicated English words that the women did not know, but they understood the way his mouth tightened when he said them. One night, Emil's breathing changed. It came in short, harsh pulls, with a rattling sound deep in his chest. His skin felt hotter than the Arizona sun outside. Wusikit thermometer climbed to 105 degrees Fahrenheit. Katharina felt that number like a blow. Her own brother had died of lung sickness as a child. The sound from Emil's chest was the same. She sent for Richardson at once. He pressed his stethoscope to Emil's back, listened a long time, and frowned. This was no longer a simple camp illness. The little boy needed more than cool cloths and rationed medicine. His notes from that day were plain. Child age 3, German national. Severe measles, likely lung complication. Camp facilities inadequate. Recommend transfer to full hospital. He knew the rules. Prisoners were to be treated humanely according to the Geneva Convention, but they were still prisoners. Moving 3 German children outside the wire to a civilian hospital would mean guards, trucks, and a lot of paperwork. There were also questions of public anger. American families had sons still fighting and dying in the Pacific. Richardson sent the request anyway. It climbed quickly through the chain of command. Camp commander, regional military government, higher offices. In files where numbers usually counted more than names, 3 German children from Barrack 7 became a test case. Did the promise on paper to care for prisoners mean anything when it cost time and effort? Within 6 hours, the answer came back stamped and signed. Transport to Phoenix Memorial Hospital approved. All 3 children were to go under guard for proper treatment. But there was a hard line too. Their mother would not go with them. Regulations stated clearly that POW civilians could not be placed freely in public institutions. Security came before comfort. When Katharina heard this through the interpreter, it felt like the floor had dropped away. "No," she said in German, shaking her head. "They are babies. They need their mother." The other woman translated her words, her voice shaking. Richardson's face was kind, but his answer did not change. "They will receive good care," he said, "but you must stay here." On August 4th, an army ambulance rolled up near the women's compound. The smell of fuel and hot rubber filled the air. Metal doors clanged open. 2 medics in white armbands moved forward with stretchers. Katharina carried Emil, his skin almost burning her arms, and walked beside Hans and Greta to the vehicle. The children's hands clung to her dress until the last possible moment. Then she had to let go. She watched them lifted into the truck, heard the engine start, and saw the doors close between her and everything that mattered. Dust rose as the ambulance pulled away, blurring the world into a brown haze. For the next 2 days, she would wait in that dust, not knowing that in a clean white building in Phoenix, another person was about to face her own choice. Phoenix Memorial Hospital stood on the north side of the city, a low cluster of brick and concrete built in 1935. Inside were bright halls, electric lights, and the sharp, clean smell of antiseptic. Outside, American cars rolled past, and in the newspapers in the lobby, headlines still talked about fighting in the Pacific. It was a strange contrast. While American sons were dying far away, 3 German prisoners' children were on their way to an American civilian hospital for care. The staff had been warned 3 German children from a POW camp would arrive by army ambulance. In the nurse's room, opinions split. One younger nurse closed her chart and said, "Our boys are bleeding on islands. Why are we treating theirs?" An older colleague shook her head. "Because they are children," she answered quietly. The hospital administrator settled it in a few words. Patients would be treated by medical need, not by nationality. It would be done under guard, but it would be done. The ambulance pulled up at a side entrance. The metal doors creaked open. Orderlies lifted out 2 stretchers and helped one small boy climb down. Emil was almost limp, his face flushed, eyes barely open. Greta clung to her broken cloth doll, cheeks wet with tears. Hans tried to stand straight, holding his jaw tight, but his legs trembled. They were taken to a private room at the end of a 3rd-floor hallway. It was not a luxury room. It was simply easier to put the enemy children away from the main ward. 2 armed guards took up positions outside the door, their boots echoing on the polished floor. The nurse assigned to that room was Mary O'Brien. She was 53 years old and had been a nurse for 27 years. She had seen soldiers with bullet wounds, factory workers with crushed hands, children with polio. Experience had given her a kind of hard shell. To do her job, she often told herself, she must think of cases, not stories. When she stepped through the door and saw the 3 German children, her first instinct was professional. She went at once to the sickest, Emil. She listened to his rattling breath, felt the burning heat of his skin, and ordered antibiotics and intravenous fluids. Over the next 48 hours, she and the doctors watched his fever slowly creep down. The electric pump on the IV clicked softly. The room smelled of rubbing alcohol and sweat, but she could not ignore the other sounds. Hans speaking rapidly in German, his voice thin with fear. Greta sobbing into her pillow, calling for Mama again and again. They did not understand a word of English, but they understood that they were far from home, far from the one person who made them feel safe. On the second night, Greta's crying would not stop. Her small shoulders shook under the thin hospital blanket. O'Brien sat down on the edge of the bed. She did something she was not required to do, something no rule book demanded. She began to sing, very softly, an old English lullaby from her own childhood. "Hush, little baby, don't say a word." The girl did not know the words, but the gentle rhythm and tone reached her. Her crying slowed, then faded to small hiccups. At last, her eyes closed. In the next bed, Hans watched, wide-eyed. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the fan and Emil's easier breathing. Early the next morning, Hans stood by the nurse's desk with his hair sticking up and his bare feet cold on the linoleum. He pointed to his sister, then to O'Brien, and said carefully in broken English, "Thank you." She felt something move inside her. "They stopped being enemy children that moment," she would later say. "They were just my patients." Still, the children's fear did not fade. Even as Emil's fever dropped and the red spots on Hans and Greta began to clear, they circled back again and again to the same question, in German, that no one understood. Where is Mama? When will she come? Their anxiety made it hard for them to eat, to sleep, to rest. O'Brien had seen enough to know that fear could slow healing. By 1945, doctors already knew that stress and poor rest could weaken the body's defenses. 3 German children alone in a strange country, in a strange building, under guard, were as stressed as children could be. One evening, she walked into the office of Dr. Harold Chun, the pediatrician in charge. He looked up from a stack of charts. "The German cases?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "They are improving, but they wake up crying. They call for their mother all day. It's hurting their recovery." He frowned. "Their mother is a prisoner of war. She can't be brought here. Security, regulations." O'Brien folded her hands to keep them from shaking. "Doctor, they are 3 and 5 and 7. They are not going to escape. They need their mother for medical reasons. They will heal faster with her here. You know that." Chun leaned back, tired. "Even if I agree, it is not my decision alone. There are forms. Commanders. Military police. Then write the forms," she said simply. "Write that a mother's presence is medically necessary. Put it in the record." Later, Chun would admit, she pushed harder for those 3 enemy children than some people did for their own. He drafted a formal request, using careful language. Maternal presence recommended as a clinical aid to recovery. That paper left the hospital, went to the administrator, then to the army liaison, then up through the military chain that already held over 370,000 German POWs in the United States. To many, it was only one more file. But to 3 children and 1 woman sitting in a hot camp, it was everything. On August 7th, the answer came back. The mother, Katharina Ferber, could be brought under guard to the hospital and remain as long as needed for the children's treatment. For the first time since they had entered the building, O'Brien could tell Hans and Greta, using simple words and gestures, that their mama was coming. Their faces changed. Hope filled the small white room. None of them yet knew just how powerful that hope would be when the door finally opened. On the morning of August 8, 1945, a truck rolled into Camp Papago Park at 8 a.m. The engine rattled in the cool of early day. By then, Katharina had been awake for hours. She had washed her face again and again in the tin basin, smoothed her prison dress until the fabric would not lie any flatter. The other women watched her in silence. Everyone knew where she was going. and why. 2 guards helped her climb into the back of the truck. The wooden bench was rough under her hands. No one on board spoke German. The doors closed with a hollow thud, and the truck pulled out through the gate. Behind her, the 700 acres of fences and barracks grew smaller. Ahead stretched an open road and a desert that seemed never to end. The drive to Phoenix took about 90 minutes. The truck smelled of oil, dust, and old canvas. Through a small gap in the back flap, Katharina saw the land slide by, flat fields, low houses, then the city itself with its straight streets and shining windows. She sat very still between the guards, trying to make herself small, trying not to imagine what she might find at the hospital. 3 graves or 3 beds. At Phoenix Memorial, she was led through a side entrance. Her steps echoed on the shiny floor. The air was cool after the heat outside. A German-American interpreter had been called from the city. Through him, she was given rules. She would wear a badge, stay in one room, obey the guards. 2 soldiers would be outside the door at all times. She nodded, not because she fully understood, but because every second of talk was another second her children were alone. They took the elevator up to the 3rd floor. At the end of a quiet hallway stood a door with 2 armed guards on either side. One opened it. Inside, under the pale light, were 3 small beds. Katharina could not move. Then Hans saw her. He pushed himself up, his eyes wide, his face changing from fear to shocked joy in a heartbeat. "Mama!" he shouted. Greta turned, saw her mother, and began to cry so hard she could not speak at all. Emil slept, his chest rising and falling more calmly now, his cheeks no longer as red. Katharina did what any mother would do. She went first to the smallest, to Emil. Her hand went to his forehead, then to his chest. His skin was warm, not burning. His breath came more evenly. Only then did she pull Hans and Greta to her, one under each arm. They clung to her, speaking in fast, tangled German, trying to tell her everything at once, how afraid they had been, how strange the place was, how much they had missed her. Mary O'Brien stood near the wall and watched. She had seen many reunions, but this one was different. 2 guards at the door wiped at their faces, pretending it was just the dryness of the hospital air. It was like someone had turned on the light in that room, she would later say. For the next 3 days, Katharina hardly left her children's side. A simple iron cot was brought in, squeezed, between the beds. At night, she lay there listening to their breathing. When Emil stirred, she was already at his side with a hand on his back. During the day, she helped with small tasks, wiping faces, encouraging sips of water, coaxing them to eat the soft hospital food that tasted strange but safe. She and O'Brien learned to speak to each other in a mix of broken English, German words and gestures. Water, pain, better, sleep. Simple terms passed back and forth like shared tools. At night, when the lights dimmed and the hallway grew quiet, Katharina sang German lullabies in a soft, low voice. The tune curled through the open doorway. Nurses walking past sometimes paused for a second, hearing a language they had been told to hate, now filled only with tenderness. The change in the children was clear. With their mother in the room, Emil began to eat properly, swallowing spoonfuls of broth without turning away. His fever stayed down. His breathing eased. Hans stopped waking up from nightmares soaked in sweat. Greta's shoulders, which had been tight with fear, loosened. She even laughed once when a doctor made a funny face. Before they boarded the train, a package arrived with their names on it, sent through official channels from Phoenix. Inside were 3 gifts. For Hans, a baseball glove and a ball, the leather smelling of oil and newness. A note, translated for him, said, "So you can play American games and remember that children should never be enemies." For Greta, bright hair ribbons in colours she had not seen in years, red, blue, yellow, that felt smooth under her fingers. Her note read, "For a brave little girl, may you grow up where children do not have to be so brave." For Emil, a small stuffed bear, soft and warm to the touch. His note said, "For the youngest patient, remember that love can be stronger than any rule." They carried these objects with them on the long journey, through the train ride smelling of coal and metal, across the sea where the salt wind stung their faces, and into a ruined Germany where the air was full of dust and smoke. In many cities, more than half of all homes lay smashed or burned. Bridges were twisted, roads broken, water and power lines shattered. Katharina and the children stayed first in a displaced persons camp, then with distant family near Munich. Life was hard. Food was rationed, buildings were cold, and memories of the war hung over everything. Yet in the middle of that grey struggle, there were bright spots: a girl with American ribbons in her hair, a boy tossing an American ball, a small bear on a shelf. Over the years, the children grew up with the story of Arizona and the hospital. Hans became a teacher. He wanted young people to understand not just battles and borders, but also the small choices that shape lives. In 1968, he emigrated to the United States. One day, he stood outside Phoenix Memorial Hospital with his own children, pointing up at its windows. "I was very sick in there," he told them. "An American nurse fought the rules so that your grandmother could stay by my bed. Greta kept the ribbons all her life, the colors a little faded, the cloth fraying at the edges. When she gave them to her daughter, she also gave the story of Mary O'Brien. An enemy gave these to me," she would say. "Remember that when someone tells you other nations have no heart." Emil, who could not remember the hospital clearly, but had heard the story again and again, became a doctor in Munich, working with children. He understood that medicine was not only about pills and instruments, but also about touch, trust, and who was allowed to stand by the bed. "I am here because someone broke a rule," he said once. "It would be wrong if I forgot that." For 30 years, letters moved back and forth between Munich and America. O'Brien wrote about her work, her aging hands, the new machines in the hospital. Katharina wrote about rebuilding, about her children's schools and jobs, about a Germany trying to learn from its past. The paper grew thinner with each reading, the ink fading but still legible. In 1965, Mary O'Brien finally travelled to Europe. She added Munich to her route. In a small apartment there, she and Katharina met again, for the first time since that August. O'Brien took notes. She wrote down how many hours they slept, how much they ate, how their pulses slowed to healthier rates. When Dr. Chun reviewed the charts, he could not ignore it. "The presence of the mother," he wrote in a formal report, "has clearly improved recovery for all 3 children." It was a simple sentence that quietly broke the old rule that security must always come first. On August 12th, less than a week after Katharina arrived, Chun cleared the children for discharge. They would all go back to Camp Papago Park together, under guard, but as a family. Before they left, O'Brien did something personal. She handed Greta a box. Inside was a new doll with a porcelain face and a fresh cloth dress that smelled faintly of starch and shop air. Greta stared, afraid to touch it. "Why?" she asked in German. Through the interpreter, O'Brien answered, "Because you needed something beautiful." The little girl suddenly hugged the doll to her chest, then threw her arms around the nurse. For a moment, 2 people from enemy nations stood holding each other in a hospital room where rules had bent to make room for love. When the truck carried the family back through the camp gates, their story moved quickly from barrack to barrack and from guard post to guard post. Germans and Americans told it for different reasons, but it planted the same quiet question in many minds. If an enemy nurse could fight to keep a German mother with her sick children, what else about this war, and about the people in it, might be different from what they had been told? That question would not fade when the war ended. It would follow Katharina, her children, and Mary O'Brien through the years ahead. By September 1945, the war was over, but the camps were still full. In the United States alone, more than 370,000 German prisoners waited behind fences for news of transport home. At Camp Papago Park, talk shifted from rations and work details to dates and ships. When would they leave? Where would they land? What would be left of Germany when they got there? One afternoon, Katharina was called to the camp office. There, handed to her by a guard, was something she had not expected. A letter from Phoenix Memorial Hospital. The paper crackled in her hands. With the help of the camp interpreter, she heard Mary O'Brien's words read out loud. "Caring for Hans, Greta, and Emil," the nurse had written, "was one of the most meaningful experiences of my career. They reminded me why I chose this work, to heal and to comfort, no matter who the patient is." O'Brien wished them a safe return to a peaceful Germany and added, "Tell them that Nurse Mary in America will always remember them." Katharina kept the letter folded in a small cloth bag with her few precious things. She answered as best she could in careful German, knowing each line would be checked by censors. "Thank you for seeing my children as children first," she wrote. "I was told Americans were monsters. You showed me Americans can choose kindness." The letters crossed the ocean by military post, little bridges of ink between former enemies. In November, repatriation began. Trains carried prisoners west to California, then ships took them to ports in Europe. Katharina and her children left Camp Papago Park in early December 1945. Hans translated as they sat over coffee. They spoke of the hospital room, the guards at the door, the songs at night. Both women were older now, their hair streaked with grey, their hands lined. "You saved my children," Katharina said. "I argued with some papers," O'Brien replied. "You saved them with your love." A few years later, historians found their story in camp records and hospital files. They wrote about it in studies of POW treatment and the Geneva Convention. This wasn't propaganda, one historian noted. This was reality, a rule broken so that 3 small enemies could become simply children again. Mary O'Brien died in 1982 at age 90. Her family told the story of the German children at her funeral. Katharina died in 1987 at 74. In her things, Hans found O'Brien's first letter, folded and worn soft from years of being opened and read. He later donated it to a museum on POWs in America, where it rests behind glass, a quiet witness to a choice made in one hospital room. From a camp in the desert to a file in an archive, this brief act of mercy outlived the war. It did not change borders, but it changed how a few people, and then many more, understood their former enemies. In the end, this story is larger than one camp, one nurse, or one family. Katharina and her children had come to America expecting monsters. They left knowing the names and handwriting of friends. The guards and doctors who watched a rule bend for mercy discovered that enemies could be healed, not just contained. They had come as conquerors and captors. They left, in a sense, as students of their own ideals. Across oceans and decades, one broken regulation showed that the sharp line between us and them is not drawn by flags but by choices. War had tried to make everyone forget that. A nurse, a doctor, a guard, and a mother quietly remembered. In the end, the most powerful force in this story was not barbed wire or stamped orders, but the simple decision to treat enemies as human beings.